And we learned last week that Zoom now does that nice little trick for us. So again, welcome everybody. You recall last week we were actually going through elements of Baptist history, particularly inside of what we might think of as being English separatism. Everybody remember that? Who was here? That we were going through sort of the history that was there. We talked about there's sort of these three broad schools of, or broad camps of understanding what, we think of as modern Baptist heritage would be. And we talked about, this idea of sometimes referred to as landmarkism or succession. I struggle with this word, secession versus secessionism. Secession means to withdraw from like the Union, like what happened during the Civil War. Successionism are things that come in sequence. And I know what the difference of those two words are in my head, but sometimes they don't come out of my mouth the same way. So if I use the wrong one, forgive me there. But this idea of successionism, remember what successionism was about? And I'm going to go pull something off my bookcase while y'all talk about that.
Trail of blood. We've been doing this all along.
In doing some long overdue cleanup and reorganization of my bookcase, I knew this existed somewhere. I finally found.
And I forgot mine with it.
My actual copy of Trail of Blood. But just so you know, I'm not joshing you. That chart that we've been looking at, there's the fold out chart in the back. Looks exactly like what we talked about. I remember it being a little bit bigger, but I finally found it in the, actually I've committed to go back and I have the digital version of this. In fact, I think I posted that on the Sunday school website, but I'm actually gonna go back through and read some of this here in the coming week. But actually, made me feel good to find this. I knew this existed somewhere. I knew I had not thrown it away. I knew I had it, and I finally laid my hands on it again. So that was the one school of thought. Anybody remember what one of the other schools of thought was?
You already said it.
Landmarkism. No, landmarkism and secessionism are tied together.
English separation.
The English separatist thing. And then the third thing was the influence by who?
Anabaptist.
By Anabaptists. All right. You guys, I was thinking about this week, not to toot our own horn or to pat my back, or we'll pat y'all's back. You guys probably know more about Anabaptists, I'm guessing, than about 95% of the people that you would encounter in any church in the United States at this point.
So, or we probably know more about church history.
That may be true. And I don't know if that, I think that's both a good thing and a bad thing. I mean, that's part of the reason we went down this path, was to understand that heritage and why it's important to understand that. So
I never heard of the term until your class.
Anabaptist?
Yeah.
So in terms of the English separatist approach to this, we talked about a couple of key people. A guy named Smith with a Y, right? The thing you'll probably most remember about, I'm going to say Joseph Smith, but his name is not Joseph Smith.
I was confused about that too.
Yeah, that's a different thing. That's a different Smith, but we're talking specifically about John Smith with a Y. What do you remember about John Smith?
He was real conscious of not having been properly baptized, so he had to go to the Mennonites so that he could be baptized by an ordained minister.
Yeah.
But he was trained as a Puritan, right?
He was trained as an Anglican minister.
Anglican.
Right, so Church of England.
And then disagreed with the church.
Right.
And left.
Yeah. He moved into the Mennonite donut shop.
Yes.
Which I was reminded of yesterday morning when my wife brought me Shipley's. So that made me a happy camper. But if you recall, the thing that I guess I will always remember about him, all of those things are more important than the thing I'm going to remember about him, except it does tie. Remember, he was the one that baptized himself. And that's what led to his concern that he had been not properly baptized. And in some ways he's a sad sort of tragic figure. That happens in like 1607 through 1609. By 1612, when he dies out of fellowship with any group of believers. And we talked a little bit about Thomas Helwys, who was with him and then opposed him because he had gone over, seemed to be influenced a little bit more by Mennonite theology than he would have preferred. And then, of course, Hellas is the one that came back and boldly wrote a pretty scathing book about King James I and was kind enough to send an autographed copy to the king, letting him know about that. So Hellas is one of the early leaders of the Baptist movement in London. And we spent a lot of time talking about the difference between particular and general Baptists. Anybody just in a sentence or two remember the difference there?
Oh, particular Baptists that was about Calvinism. Particular was that Christ had died particularly to save those who have been chosen.
Right. The particular / limited atonement view of that. And then the general Baptists were leaning more towards which camp? Yeah. It's important to understand that in the early churches as they existed in England, this is primarily around London, which were there more of?
No, 96.6.
Which were there more of? Particular Baptists or general Baptists?
A little bit of both.
I don't know.
We actually, there was one slide about this, it may have slide. There were actually more particular Baptists than there were general Baptists. So the early Baptist movement inside of Anglican separatism, sentence I never thought I would utter in my life, but there we go, leaned a little bit more towards elements of Calvinistic theology in the terms of being more particular Baptist versus being general Baptist. And we'll pick up a little bit on this when we get Baptists over to America, which we're going to start on talking about today. But just understanding that, and particularly where we left off last week, we're going to do a little bit more of the quick review here to get up to where we let off so we can jump into this. But remember that what happened during most of the 17th century, be they general Baptists or particular Baptists, in London? What's the common theme of the 17th century Baptist in England?
Is Cromwell reigning?
Most of the time it's persecution.
I was gonna say, until Cromwell, isn't it persecution?
Yep, under James I, that we know of the King James Bible, under Charles I, his son, even more so, up until the period of time of the English Civil War and the rise of Parliament taking control. This is the age of Oliver Cromwell and the Roundheads, where for a period of about 12/13 years, there is no king. Things are run directly by Parliament. During that period of time, there was a loosening of the restrictions that had happened under James and Charles, both of them the first. But then when things swung back in 1660, with Charles II being placed on the throne, things swung back in the other direction. And so as a result, after about a decade of where there was a lot of freedom, remember they come back, and this is where I'm actually going to start sharing some, to get this up on the screen, Shift F5. So, share the screen. Didn't set this up beforehand, so I'm having to do it live in real time. Share screen too. And actually click the share button this time. So here is Charles II. Lives from 1630 to 1685, but he reigns as King of England from, you guys can see this, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, from 1660 to 1685. So he's the restoration of the monarch. He attempted to introduce religious freedom for Catholics and Protestant dissenters in 1672 with what was called the Declaration of Indulgence, but the Parliament, who had now swung back after the restoration of the king back to being much more what had been before the time that Cromwell was in charge, they forced him to withdraw it. So he tried to bring a little bit more religious liberty to play, but that was short-lived and did not stick. And so what's known as the later Stuart era, this is a Stuart king from 1660 to 1688. is again more of the persecution. In fact, some of the greatest persecutions actually happened during this particular period of time. And Baptists were sort of singled out because remember, they were the ones that had the strongest stance on religious liberty. That's what Helwys had written about in his book back in the early 17th century. And so anything that was sort of wrong that was going on with the church and state in England, Baptists were some of the first ones to get blamed for that. And that led to the Act of Uniformity. So remember in 1672, eventually he tries to do the Declaration of Indulgence. But in 1662, shortly after his resumption of the throne, the Act of Uniformity. And this required that all ministers, deacons, bishops, etc., be ordained exclusively through the Church of England. The only things that were allowed were those things that were consistent with Church of England practice, including the Book of Common Prayer. And so this was uniformity. The same doctrine, same beliefs had to exist across the board. And as a result of that, we talked about the Great Ejection. About 20% of the English clergy were kicked out of their positions because of the Act of Uniformity. And of course, this included Presbyterians, which were the Calvinists that had Scottish influence, Congregationalists, Independents, and of course, Baptists. So about 2,500 ministers. In fact, we talked a little bit about this thing over here on your right is to use the cover of it was a collection of published last sermons from some of these ministers that were kicked out of their positions, which is sort of an interesting thing. It was, they're sort of swan songs as they were leaving there. That did lead to King James II after Charles II. The sequence is James, Charles, Charles, James, with Cromwell in the middle. He was actually a Roman Catholic, and he's the last Roman Catholic monarch of England. And eventually the Glorious Revolution, named so by the people who won. The winners always get to pick the names of things, right? In 1688, he's caught fleeing the country. They do let him leave the country. And this is, of course, what brings in William and Mary with assistance from the Netherlands, from the Dutch fleet. And they're brought in specifically because they are Protestant. So if you think back to Henry VIII, who breaks, do you remember the year that the act of supremacy was proclaimed?
Where's our chart that tells us?
1534 is the Act of Supremacy. So Luther taxed the theses in 1517, right?
Right.
And it's about a decade and a half later that Henry proclaims the Act of Supremacy, breaking England away from the church, again, for different reasons. But recognize the fact that we're now talking from 1534 until 1688. So we're talking here of a period of about 150 years. And as we've gone through this, what's happened during that 150 years with the practice of religion in England? It's been a roller coaster ride for the most of that, right?
It really is.
Particularly, the stable sort of neutral period is during most of Elizabeth's reign. So the latter part of the 16th century. So, maybe about a third of that roughly is pretty stable, but she only stabilizes things after Mary and after Henry before, and then we see the things that come after. So just imagine, that for 150 years, this is what happened. This was the back and forth. And so you can sort of understand by the time you get to 1688 and the time of the Glorious Revolution, the things that have happened that we've looked at just last week in our discussion in the last roughly century, a little bit less than a century, you can understand why there was a desire to just finally get this thing settled, and why the idea of, oh, now we have another monarch that leans Catholic. We're not going to do that. Literally was sort of the attitude that had come into play. And of course, now England had been Protestant in various forms now for multiple generations, right? So it was a very different situation to have a Catholic monarch in 1685 than it was to have a Catholic monarch at the time of Mary, which is what in the 1540s period of time. So this finally ends the back and forth in England between Protestantism and Catholicism for the most part. Any questions or comments about that?
I was just thinking, looking back on, especially in the 17th century, the back and forth that we had just in the middle of the 17th century, if you were a really devoted Christian who tried to follow the beliefs of your church, your head must have just been spinning, because every other decade they were, every 10 years or so, they were telling you to believe just exactly the opposite of what you've been believing the decade before. And if you weren't really a devoted Christian, but if you really were just kind of going along and figured, well, these guys know what they're talking about, so I'll listen. It must have been even worse. There must have been a huge amount of apathy created by this within the church among believers, that nobody seemed to know anything, so why bother?
I think all of those things and more are true. I think those are really good insights, Doug, in the sense of, I think it's difficult to, it should be easy, but I think it's difficult to put your head in the average person that was quote unquote in the pew at the time, right?
Yeah.
And understanding that how influenced we are by the period of time that we grow up in and what we're taught. We all have for better or worse, we all have the experience of being raised in, especially if we were raised in Christian homes and various denominations and brought to church by our parents that were in those denominations. You heard those teachings, and for the most part, the nature of most religious teaching is you don't spend a lot of time learning about the things that are in disagreement to your belief systems.
Yeah.
Which makes sense, right? But it also at the same time is a dangerous thing, because you've never then been exposed to other schools of thought, or you only believe it because you've been told. I think that, I've said this before, and I think others of you have said something similar. I think that's one of the major reasons when our kids go off to college sometimes, and then they're exposed, these are kids that have grown up in the church and they're exposed to other ideals. They're not ready for that exposure to other ideals. They're at an age and a time in life, when you start questioning and thinking about things. And if they're holding on to mom and dad's faith, or they've only been given one perspective without understanding what the other is and how to properly distinguish that or whatever, it's a dangerous thing that goes on. And, we talked here so much as we've gone through this process of what's the relationship, what has been the relationship all the way through, which is what this is about. We even see it here. What's the relationship between church and state?
Well, up until now, they've been in bed with one another.
It's very difficult. To the extent that they're separate, it's very difficult to separate them. And we've talked about one of the unique characteristics of Anabaptists and then Baptist here is this idea of the fact that they should be separated.
Yes.
Recognizing that this period of time we're talking about here and the things we talked about last week, and we're going to talk about moving into the American expression of this was new. This was radical. We take it for granted now because of the First Amendment in this country that church and state are intentionally supposed to be separate. That was not the concept. It was very much a different thing. So back to Doug's point, which I think is a thing here. What is the church telling me? What is the state telling me? By the way, the church and the state are the same thing, or they tell me they're the same thing. This was a very difficult time to be a believer in terms of, distinguishing that for yourself. And on top of that, what was the average level of education for the average person sitting in the pew? Literacy was much higher than it had been, centuries before, but access to books, access to education was not there. I mean, Kathy and I watched a documentary last night. Some stuff's running through my head from that. It was a documentary on Queen Elizabeth and Princess Margaret and their relationship. And I now live in a house again with a very strong Anglophile in terms of my daughter. And so we tend to see and hear these things, and it's interesting there. And most of you probably know the story pretty well about Elizabeth was never going to be queen, but the abdication of her uncle and her father moving into the role and all the things that happened there. But what struck me, this was in the 1930s, moving into the 1940s. So they said what 4-year age difference between Elizabeth and Margaret. So at around the age of 12 is when it's now clear, because of the abdication, which was in 38, if my memory serving me correctly, 37 or 38. Suddenly now the
Elizabeth was 10.
Elizabeth was 10 when Edward abdicated, and so her father became George the Sixth. So suddenly now she's next. She's the presumptive heir. She's next in line to the throne. Well, up until then, in 1930s aristocratic English society, she's a member of the royal family, but she's the other part of the royal family because her father's the younger brother. What was Elizabeth's education? They were teaching her how to
play the piano
and French,
probably sing, dance, and a language,
and learn a little French,
but not like
an education that we think of today.
History or
And so one of the things that was mentioned in this documentary is, well, suddenly when she's now in line to be queen, the heir apparent, they suddenly alter her educational course, and she actually starts getting what I'll call quote unquote a real education. You know who didn't get a real education apparently? Her sister Margaret, because keep learning how to play the piano, do a little knitting, and learn French. This is in the 20th century. So I was thinking about how this applies back now to the 16th century, the 17th century. First of all, just access by the general public to education, but imagine you're a female sitting in a pew during that period of time. Because imagine what you were like, remember the royal family in the 20th century and what you were getting as an education. It's a little bit scary. So this is how things have evolved. And again, Baptists played a major role in this evolution. Now, when William of Orange comes over with his wife Mary, in 1689, the Act of Toleration is passed. I think this is pretty much what we got to last week. The Act, first of all, understand, did not offer full religious liberty. What do we mean there? Well, you could be a dissenter. It was okay to be a dissenter, to be a separatist, but you still had to pay your tithes to the Church of England. You still had to register your meetings if you were meeting outside the church, and you had to take the customary oaths of allegiance. So you were allowed to practice separately, provided you still supported the official church financially. Your meetings could not be in secret. They had to be registered and known, and you still had to take oaths of allegiance to the crown, because if you were going to be separate in a religious sense, it had to be clear that you were not separate in a political sense. But it did create an ability for there to be an open door for some religious freedom that, again, Baptists were able and others were able to enjoy for the first time, or enjoy again officially under a monarch, because they had enjoyed something similar under Cromwell. And so the Act of Toleration in 1689, Baptists are credited with being one of the major groups that created and supported the Act, probably more than any other separatist group inside of England. Baptist historian H. Wheeler Robinson says that Baptists belong to the distinction of being the first to claim and the first to apply fearlessly the unfettered principle of freedom for religion. And this was not just limited to particular Baptists, although there were more particular Baptists, but general and particular Baptists shared the idea of religious liberty. So 1689 is an important date in English religious history. It's a very important date in our Baptist heritage. Questions or comments about that?
So basically, did it mean they'd pay their tithe to the Anglican church and then they'd also go ahead and tithe or
Support
offering
whatever support you're going to have
to their church?
Exactly.
Sounds like modern day private school.
Pay your school taxes and pay your tuition, right? 1689 is also a landmark. Also a landmark year. I'm sorry, Doug. What?
And abide by certain guidelines.
1689 is also a landmark year. We talked about this. This is actually where we, I think, left off formally last week, in that the London Baptist Confession is published. And so, by the way, I don't know if Lori's there, but Lori, thank you for the link that you posted on the website back to a whole bunch of religious things. So if you want to go find some other documents, including getting a direct access to the text of this, you can find it on the link that that Lori posted there on the Sunday school website. But the London Baptist Confession was not the first published Baptist confession. We looked at one earlier that had happened in the 40s, in the 1640s. But this is the one that was published in direct response back to the Act of Toleration. So now there's not going to be any pushback because of the Act of Toleration. It was designed to put together a statement of the Confession of Faith. One of the things to note here that is of importance, and you'll notice this when you read through it, we'll dip in a little bit to this next week without going too deep into it. I'm not going to study it line for line. The London Baptist Confession does have very much a lean towards particular Baptists. They were much more involved in its writing and in its composition than the general Baptists were. And so you're going to find elements of Reformed / Calvinist theology more prevalent inside the London Baptist Confession. And I think we talked about this last week. Notice it specifically said the churches that are commonly, though falsely called Anabaptists. But this was printed in London. Actually, the one that you see here is this is actually the cover from 1644, but similar thing on the 1689. Okay, I want to spend a little time this morning just talking. We looked at this slide before, but I wanted to go back and look at it in a little more detail today before we start switching over to the history of the Baptist Church in America, which we're going to use the video guide into today. This slide, the distinctive characteristics of Baptists, looking at it more broadly. So when we talk about biblical authority, what do we mean there?
The authority of the word.
Right. Is this a Reformation concept?
Yes.
Yes.
How so?
Although the whole point,
Because Catholics have a lot of tradition that weren't
Right.
Correct.
necessarily biblically based.
Scripture rather than tradition.
Right. Which is what I wanted to elicit out there, and we talked about that a lot. One of the things, the idea of sola scriptura, which is contained in the Reformation, coming out again, the formal Lutheran side of the Reformation here, and others as well, is this idea if there's a question between tradition and the Bible, what trumps? The Bible. And tradition should only flow out of the biblical authority. So the Bible is the authority. That's not just a characteristic of Baptists. That's a characteristic of most Reformed thought in some way, shape, form, or fashion. The autonomy of the local church. We spent some time talking about this. This is greatly owed to who? This is greatly owed to that Anabaptist bent that happened there, where they, in order to be able to practice baptism as they saw fit, they needed their local church to be autonomous from the churches that existed there in the Swiss Confederation. Priesthood of all believers. What's important about that distinctive?
We don't have to talk to God through the priest. We can go directly to the throne.
Right. And that combined with the previous thing, the autonomy of the local church, is the fact that there is not a large hierarchical structure that we hold to. You don't have priests and then bishops and then cardinals and then the Bishop of Rome, who's the Pope. This idea that each of us has direct access and we don't need to go through someone else to confess. That was also a radical That was also a radical concept, not just contained to Baptists, but again, big part of the early distinctives of Baptists and to today. Ordinances. We actually haven't spent a lot of time talking about because we're going to have to circle back around. I've already promised Vicki we'll circle back around to the Orthodox Church. We're going to come back at some point, at least spend 1 week talking about the Counter-Reformation, which is the Catholic response to the Reformation. But how many things exist inside of the Catholic Church that are sort of the equivalent of ordinances? Anybody know?
There's 7.
Yeah, the 7 sacraments. They're called sacraments.
Yeah.
The use of this word ordinances is very particular. Actually, it's pretty particular to Baptists. And there's only 2, believers' baptism and the Lord's Supper. We don't hold to the various other sacraments. For example, one of the sacraments that we talked about before was that of penance, that concept of penance. That's one of the sacraments. Individual soul liberty. Now we're seeing some of the things that are creeping in here that come from the general Baptist perspective of being able to have a role in salvation, more of the Arminian thought. We've already talked about separation of church and state, and then 2 offices within the church: pastor, elders, and deacons. Can you ever think of a time that Baptists had other positions?
Well, I grew up in a church. We never called somebody elder other than older people. They were my elders, but I never had a church appointed position that was an elder. So I'm not exactly sure in scripture where elder comes from either, because I've always heard those scripture references when it's talking about the call of the deacons. We had a pastor. He was a brother or reverend. If he had a degree, I think you could call him reverend.
And sometimes they were doctors.
Right.
If they actually had a
I don't know
doctorate.
what the difference between calling him Brother Virgil and Reverend Virgil, but I never had a person of authority in the church who was called elder.
Isn't elder and pastor somewhat synonymous in scripture?
They are, and even the qualifications for deacons and pastors have overlap.
Right.
In these passages, particularly the Timothy. The Timothy passage is probably the most well-known or famous because it outlines these things. But what's clear inside of Baptist distinctives are, even with these, the blurry lines that may exist here about who they are, you don't have a hierarchical structure. There's not other offices within the church. The church is contained to these 2 offices. This you can trace back to the Baptist churches that we've looked at in the that would be the 17th century, and are true all the way down to today. This has been consistent for hundreds of years. And as you can see, it starts with biblical authority, and then there is biblical authority for each of the characteristics that are here. And again, this is a handy acrostic, the Baptist thing going now. Any questions about these? When we've talked around these, we will continue to talk about them. I thought it was a good chance just to review that these are distinctives that grew out of this. All right. I'm going to flip over to a video here. So, share sound. So this is now we had been talking about what had gone on in England, but also understand that during the period of time that we're talking about here, which is the 17th century, that English settlement of the New World has begun. For example, it's under James that the first recognized settlement happens, which is called Jamestown. There's a reason that places in South Carolina like Charleston exist for Charlestown. And so while all that stuff we were talking about before, it's been going on in England proper, there's also what's happening with the colonial efforts in the Americas. And Baptists are part of what's going on there, because many of those that have come to the English colonies in the Americas have come because of their desire to, because they're separatists, because they're dissenters, to find some element of religious freedom. So going to use this Mikey Mewborn video here from Mid-America to sort of cover some of that.
Baptist beginnings in America,
You guys hear
we
that?
kind of picture this idea of a person preaching who is lifted up, because one of the big things in early churches in America was a raising up of the Word of God. And so whoever was preaching the Word of God had to be held higher up than everybody else. And it's not because the person was better than everybody else, but the Word of God had to be the center of the focus, because everything was focused in Scripture. And hence this picture kind of shows some of that. But before 1700, most Baptist churches in America were in New England. Late in the 1600s, more churches began to pop up in the middle colonies, and we'll see that as we go. Most churches were pastored by men with a British background. Of course, many of the Baptists in early America were separate, but somewhat connected to the British culture. The interesting thing about this, we will look at a guy named Roger Williams today, is that he saw these people definitely coming to the New World, starting something new, but they had not broken off enough or separated enough from the British culture and the Church of England and the way of doing things. And he believed very strongly in religious freedom, and that was not happening as much because the British culture, the British people, and their thoughts were coming over with many of the immigrants that were coming over at the time. But many of the early church settlers in New England were militant Puritans. This is what they were like. They had a godly zeal.
So let's make sure we define what that is, because we talked about it before. Remember, there were separatists and there were Puritans. Are those the same thing?
Puritans wanted to fix the church.
Right. The Puritans were inside the church wanting to fix it. The separatists were those who had sort of reached the conclusion that things weren't going to change and therefore we need to separate. So many of these folks that are coming to New England, the New World, but primarily in New England, are coming as members. Formally, they are members of the Church of England, but they're coming with Puritan ideals, and that's why they've come over. Is they feel like they can create the new correct version of the Church of England in New England. New England, new church, more correct. So they are very much, and militant is a strong word here. We're going to talk a little bit about what that means.
But they had uncompromising doctrines and applications. And so there was no discussion, there was no conversation. This is how it was. They were very strong in that. Congregational church was created to be the official state church of New England, and that was a very legalistic type of church at the time. They believed in progress, but they also believed in a form of persecution that could be brought upon people as well. I wanted to show you a little bit about the Puritans at the time. When women were responsible for making sure children grew into good Puritan adults. Puritans were strict parents who loved their children very much. They used mental discipline and love, but if it didn't work, they would use physical force. The practice of sending out was used. Children often were sent to stay with other families for training, discipline, apprenticeship, etc. Puritan parents were discouraged from showing affection so that children would be ready to obey God's laws. And the whole point of this Puritan model was to set up a strict way of living that guides people into a system of thinking and a system of actions. And there can be a lot of checks and balances in this. If they don't memorize these scriptures, they can be punished. And so there was this checks and balances to becoming what they thought was a good Puritan, or in their minds, a great Christian. And that's what they're looking at. But kind of to get started a little bit into American understanding that, John Winthrop, English Puritan lawyer, one of the founders and leaders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He was legalistic puritanical leader in New England. He led the first wave of English Puritans into New England in 1630, served as governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony for 12 years. This man here brought a freshness, a seriousness to the New World, and incredibly smart, incredibly able. And he was a governor for Massachusetts for 12 to 20 years, which is a very strong position that he had. And so he was known for just being a person who has it all together, crossing the T's, dotting the I's. He had it together, and that's why the Massachusetts Bay Colony became such a strong colony. Now, with that being said, some people saw him as being too harsh, and that's when you get into guys like Roger Williams, who lived from 1603 to 1683, born in London, unusual skill in recording sermons with shorthand. And this is what a guy, Sir Edward Coke, noticed that, gave him a job in his law office and mentored him and taught him. What was interesting is while he was in there, he saw punishment that was happening, religious punishment that was happening toward dissenters or nonconformists. And he didn't understand it. He thought, why are these people being punished for believing something? And this is kind of what starts his whole idea of thinking, or his whole thought process on religious liberty and separation of church and state. He learned how to frame laws, and he set up governments. He went to Pembroke College in Cambridge, and so he was very, very intelligent. Went through his bachelor's degree there, and he did not finish his master's degree there for matters that he was trying to work on other things. What we see Roger Williams, kind of a young sketch of him here, and but he's known for being the founder of Rhode Island. And 1603 is when, of course, he was born, but it's not that long into his life that he is in America, and he is making a huge difference there. And so we're going to see that Roger Williams was raised in Anglican, sympathetic, though, toward the religious dissenters. He was persecuted by his father when seeking to help the Puritan movement. So even his own father came completely against him and was very harsh toward him. He became a private chaplain, which was common in many small communities, and that's what he kind of focused in on. Williams eventually married Mary Barnard, the daughter of a minister, and was a great companion for him throughout his life. She was just an excellent person to come alongside of him. This is a statue of him in front of Roger Williams University, and so this school is actually pretty large, but a lot of it, and it's non-religious, but a lot of it is based on his stances of his disciplines, also his stances on having this religious liberty and just being a person who goes after things. And so there's a lot of history there dealing with what he had done. But as we continue on, Williams was a separatist. He had separated from the Church of England because he thought it was the false church, right? And true Christians needed to withdraw. That's what he believed. In 1631, Williams was installed as minister in Salem, near Boston. Here's what happens is they hear about him as being so capable, so knowledgeable, and they wanted to bring him into Salem, where the Congregational Church, and there's this very strong church movement that's taking place there. And so they said, we wanted a very able person to come in. Well, he came in, but he moved to Plymouth in the summer after Boston authorities came against him in Salem. They didn't like what he was teaching. They didn't like what he was doing. And they didn't like his whole focus of this idea of true freedom. And so they began to pull away from him and actually come against him is what they really did. But Williams served in Plymouth from 1631 to 1633. Williams in Plymouth, though, learned many Native American languages. He learned to speak to the Native Americans, and throughout your book, that our textbook we're going through, it's normally they're called Indians, but I'm going to call them Native Americans throughout our study here. But he conducted missionary work with these Native Americans. He believed that Native Americans were the true landowners of American land, and that England or New Englanders should buy it from them. So he truly felt that these people were here first. These people own the land. These people work and live off the land. It's theirs. It is wrong for us to come in and take from them, no matter how you do it, if you do it in the name of Christ or not. And he sees this as a very wrong way of thinking. And so here's kind of a picture of him having a relationship with the Native Americans, and he's ministering to them and telling them about the Lord Jesus Christ and all those things. This became a very hot topic issue that he was having to deal with, of course, with the authorities in Boston. And so the Boston court came against him very strongly in these types of things. Because of William's different stance about doctrine and practice against the Church of England and his sympathy toward Native Americans, he was commanded to leave New England. They didn't even want him around because they thought he was toxic, or he was like a disease in the community because of what he was teaching was not in line and what they were teaching. He fled into the wilderness and received care from Native Americans. So what he does is he goes into the wilderness and he gets care from the people that he's been ministering to, which I find that almost ironic, because here's a person that's come to America to spread the gospel of Christ and to build up people, and he's getting kicked out by these people. And so he ends up going, and the people that take care of him are the people that he's ministering to, which I find so incredible, but that's what's happening. In June 1636, Williams and a group from Salem established a church community outside of Massachusetts Bay jurisdiction, and the colony is called Providence. I think that's it's almost poetic when you think about it, how God's providence had allowed them to go there and create a colony. And so he writes later on, when he goes to England and he's working on a charter, he writes this book, and it's a plea for religious liberty, a powerful book that talks about his desire and his love for religious liberty and the need for religious liberty. And so he writes that in 1644. Well,
so if you know the geography of New England, modern geography, you have a pretty good idea where Massachusetts is. I didn't pull a map for this, but if you think about Massachusetts, it bends around Massachusetts Bay. There's Cape Cod that extends out there. I know Kathy and I have had the privilege of having gone to Providence and Rhode Island, which is absolutely, particularly there at I can't think of it, Newport. is absolutely beautiful. But it is directly south. I mean, it literally is right there. Rhode Island's right underneath Massachusetts, and is not far from Plymouth. Plymouth was actually on the southern end of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and so it's really not that far at all from Plymouth to where Providence was founded. And so notice what he did. He left. He was basically kicked out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, New England at the time. Talked about the period of time that he spent with the Native Americans who he had administered to. It's a little unclear to me when I tried to do some research there about how many actually were converted versus just being friendly towards him. But certainly there were converts that were one. But then he comes back and he founds the colony. When he founds the colony, if you look back, let's slide back here in time, notice the timing on that was that he left in 1636 to form a church community that was outside of the jurisdiction of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Massachusetts Bay Colony had been authorized by who? It was a crown colony. And so it derived its existence from the fact that it had a charter that had been given by, actually going back, this is during the period of time transitioning from James I to Charles I. He called the colony Providence. Again, this is in 1636. What I wanted to point out here was, notice it's not until, this is where we'll pick back up with the video a little bit here. Let me slide over to it. The Rhode Island Charter is not provided until 1663. Remembering the timeline that we just went through, what happened between the 1630s and the 1660s in England? This is the period of time when Cromwell and the Roundheads rise to power, and so Parliament is in control from around 1648 to 1660. So there actually is a period of time when there's no king in England or queen in England to sort of enforce things. And so they're able to sort of live outside of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, but there's no backing of the king to sort of force this for much of this period of time. But they don't have a charter. They're sort of, if you will, they're sort of squatting in the New World.
Squatting.
And taking advantage of where they are. But what's different about this, and I'm going to start the video back up here, is understanding what was contained in the Rhode Island Charter, which is important.
Rhode Island Royal Charter that's put into place in July 1663, approved by King James II. And this is put together. Roger Williams is one of the people that helped put this together, outlined it. But it outlined many freedoms for its inhabitants for 180 years. One of the longest standing documents that we know of. It was different compared to all other English colonies. Colonists had a freedom to elect their own governor. Colonists could write their own laws. Charter stated that no person residing in the colony could be molested, punished, disquieted, or called in question for any differences in opinion in matters of religion. This place was very unique. It became friendly to anybody from religious views. So if you think about the Jews, the Quakers, whoever, they were coming in, they were allowed to come into Rhode Island, and they enjoyed freedom there, which is very unique. And Roger Williams is a main reason for that. Nathan Finn, who was one of, worked at Union University for a while there, on faculty there. He said this: Baptists have traditionally argued for religious liberty for all people by advocating a free church in a free state. You'll see Roger Williams. He will soon become a Baptist in his life, and we'll see some of that, and then he'll change later on into what we call a seeker. But his whole point was religious liberty, and that's one of the distinctives for the Baptist faith. And so that concludes our.
So when we see a statement like that now, we go, well, of course that makes sense. That's, it's religious liberty. It was unusual for the time. And they talk about there, we'll pick this up a little bit as we start looking at things, carrying this down a little bit further next week, is that at the time that he separates from the Puritan, I'll call it church there in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and goes off on independent here, he's not just a Baptist theologically. He really is a separatist and a dissenter away from the Puritan movement, but he eventually grows into adopting, for most of that period of time, Baptist theology, and then as it mentions that he becomes a little bit more of a seeker later in his life, going a little bit further. But Rhode Island is considered to be the first Baptist colony. And again, you saw what was unique there. What did they have the right to do that no other colony did? They could elect their own. They could elect their own governor.
Yeah.
Which, this is true up until the time of the American Revolution. The governor was traditionally in most of the colonies appointed by the crown. You were the crown's representative if you were the governor. And so this idea of the direct election of the person that had the most authority there within the colony is unique, and it came as a result of further exploration and further working out of this idea of religious liberty that were contained within the separatists. Questions, comments about that?
Compromising doctrines and applications. And
Any bigger questions about anything we covered this morning?
So Don, so those that came over to what we know as America now, they were fleeing so that they could have religious liberty?
It's a combination of things. Sometimes the answer is yes. They were particularly coming to have liberty that was unique to practice their religion. However, that's not consistent all the way across. For example, the Massachusetts Bay Colony are Puritans. So they're not coming to be free from the Church of England in the classic sense. They're coming to actually make the bigger, better Church of England in their mind here.
So that's my question though. So you said that, I guess were some of them had charters from
the
the
crown.
king
Yes.
to come over?
All of the colonies, for the most part, especially during the early phases of English settlement in the New World, came under one of two types of charters. You came under a royal charter, or essentially you came under for lack of a better way of describing it, a corporate charter. And so you were either formed or you had your authority to settle or be on land because the monarch gave you that, or indirectly the monarch enabled the creation of essentially a corporation that had the right. A good example of that is the Virginia Company. You've heard of the Dutch East Indies Company. There were a number of these charters that were given by the crown, which were, you might think of them as the early forms of corporations, is the way that I tend to think of them, where these were private endeavors. These were not directly sponsored by the crown, but the crown permitted for business interests these things to be formed.
So I guess in my mind, I never realized that those that came over actually still had some sort of a connection to the crown. Like, I thought they just fled because they didn't want to have any part of the crown because of the church and state issue. But I'm learning a lot from what we talked about in that regard today.
Yeah, and it's a combination of things. It's not any one thing. Some of them fit that description and some of them don't. I mean, part of what we suffer, I think I suffer from, and we all suffer from, is the first time that we talked about, the various ways you go through American history and you get a little bit more detail each time. Sort of that simple story of the English colonization it's simplified when we're first exposed to it. And so we tend to think of it as being less complex and complicated than it really is. And it's a little bit of all these things. I mean, Williams is coming, initially he's living in a Puritan colony in the Massachusetts Bay, but he doesn't stay there. So it's mixed, it gets mixed up a little bit. It's not one thing, it's multiple things. But like particularly what I refer to as the mid-Atlantic colonies like Virginia, the Carolinas, those tend to be more of the economically chartered colonies versus the crown chartered colonies, which were more prevalent in the northern colonies, Massachusetts Bay, New York, New England. But then you have an entirely different thing when you get to Pennsylvania, because it's somewhat different in terms of having more of the Quaker background there and the break off from that. The interesting thing, one of the other smaller states, colonies that becomes a state is Maryland. Well, the Mary there is from Queen Mary, and just like Rhode Island becomes a center for Baptists in the New World, Maryland becomes a center for Catholics that have fled from England, fleeing, in this case, Protestant persecution, to come to the New World and find a place where they can practice as English Catholics, and that happens to be in Maryland.
So how or what, I mean, how and who got to come over?
Ooh, that's not one simple answer.
Okay.
Every time. It was a function of normally who had means to be able to get access to the crown to get approval, or in some cases, people just came. The example are the Pilgrims. They came under something of a permissive royal charter to be part of what eventually becomes the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Part of the problem is they don't land where they're supposed to land originally, and all the hardships that are there. So it differs by each group, and there's lots of different stories there.
Okay. Very interesting.
Yes.
And that's also by the time that when you reach the American Revolution, which is going to be, again, we want to compact these I compact these time frames ahead, in my head so often. This is the early 1600s. Well, when does the American Revolution happen? The late 1700s. So it's more than a century from when these colonies are first formed and these things are happening until, we get to where most of us get really exposed to what's going on here at the time of the American Revolution, which is after the events of the French and Indian War, 1554 to the early 1754 to the early 1760s,
Turn the light on.
and then the American Revolution in the 1770s. It's been 100 years of evolution for what's happened here.
The Civil War to now. That's how long.
Yeah. You've heard me do that a lot, trying to trace back from now to that same amount of time back to see how far back that goes. And it's a lot more than you originally necessarily think about. Because again, we study it, the way we study it in school, the way we're studying here, you do these broad sweeps where you cover decades and minutes, kind of thing. And the reality of is it takes time to do that. Plus, the New World is not only English. I mean, there's originally, for example, New York is Dutch settlement, which eventually gets taken over by England. I mean, there's all types of influences. I mean, the Pennsylvania experience there. There's a reason the Amish are there. The Pennsylvania Dutch. The New World becomes a melting pot already then of different groups coming from different places with different practices.
So I also think I've always, just wondered about the issue that this last guy had about thinking that the land belonged to the people that were already there,
Yep.
And that they should pay for it or, whatever.
Who would they have paid otherwise? The crown?
Well,
how does the crown, just because they maybe paid for the ships that sailed over, why do they think they own the land?
The answer is more or less found.
People there.
The answer is more or less found in the question there, the crown. But
I mean, again, I have a hard time. There's people there. We claim the land. That's
and there very much was, and by the way, still is, right.
It's called egocentricity.
That's correct, and it's also called, that might makes right.
Yeah.
It's
The,
our
the
land because we
legal,
have
the
the
legal
ability.
reason would be right of conquest.
Correct, which was a concept that had existed for millennia.
Thousands of
This
years,
is the
yeah.
beginning of human history.
Yeah. And
But,
still exists.
It still exists. That's exactly right.
So right of conquest, meaning that those that come in where people already are, that they have the right? Is that what you mean?
Yeah,
Is that what the right of?
this idea that we have, which is a very modern now in the most modern sense of that, this idea of self-determinations of people groups, that's only been recognized globally in any broad sense in the last century. You only need to go back to looking at, the American Revolution is in the late 18th century, but the colonial powers, here being European colonial powers, and their positions in Central and South America, their positions in Africa, particularly those in Africa, up until the middle of the 20th century, in terms of the self-determined. You can argue that it's still being argued out today in different ways, and that's not just an English thing. That was a Belgium thing. That was a Netherlands thing. That was a German thing. I mean, we sort of forget about the fact that in the late 19th century, Germany had colonies all over the world. The reason you didn't see as many of them in the 20th century was they lost two major world wars and were stripped of them.
Yeah.
Spain lost her colonial position over time and finally lost her colonial position in the very late 19th century because of the Spanish-American War in terms of global domination. Yeah,
And the other, when I really like to be argumentative, the other point that I like to bring out is that there wasn't one tribe of Native Americans. These Native Americans had been conquering lands from one another as long as they had been here.
Correct.
The Apache were in most of Texas. They had come in and wiped out some of the very primitive tribes that were along the coast and up in central Texas. And then the Comanches came in and wiped them out, chased them out to Arizona.
Oh, I see. So they
so-
had conquest.
So there was
Their own-
constant fighting going on, constant warfare.
And there were different, the Native American cultures share a lot of things in a lot of ways, but they were also very different. There, for example, the Iroquois Confederation up in the New England were for the most part a very peaceful confederation of primarily 5 tribes. They had a confederation. They actually, met in these councils and discussed things and decided things collectively. That was very different than what happened, with some of the more
patriarchal too, wasn't it?
Yes, and also some of the more, I would call them militaristic, just to use, or aggressive tribes. I mean, again, to think of them as being one personality, as as Native Americans is it's selling them very short in lots of different ways. And even the ways that Europeans, for example, the difference between the way Roger Williams interacted with them versus the way that others interacted with them was also very different. History is a lot more complicated than we like to make it. It's the way that I always like.
You can only put so much in a textbook.
Yeah, or you can't get all the subtleties of what makes it subtle, when you're moving forward over time. For example, a lot of that Apache and Comanche things that Doug accurately describes were the result of being displaced by other Native American groups and or settlers. So part of the reason they became aggressive on the plains of Texas was they were being pushed from some other place.
Hey, let's push somebody else.
Yeah.
And Europe ones pushed the Germans out.
Yeah. These things are,
Yeah.
and back to the other thing about why do you think the land would be yours? There's a lot of evidence now with modern scholarship that basically in the 50 to 100 years right before the arrival, not of Columbus, in 1492, Columbus didn't discover anything. Columbus, just was a European that got back here after others had come before. Pretty clear now the Vikings had definitely been in Newfoundland and perhaps what we think of as being even as far south as New York, or maybe even as far south as what we know as Virginia, several hundred years before, if not a millennia before. But that in the 100 years or so, right before the arrival post 1492 into the early 1500s, particularly the early 1500s with the arrival of settlers and the Spanish and the English and the French and others coming into not Central America, not Mexico, not Cuba, not the areas there, but more in the regular continent, is that there had been a widespread loss of life, essentially smallpox and other diseases that may have wiped out as much as 90% of the Native American population in the 100 years right before the arrival of European settlers. And so one of the things that caused the Europeans to believe they had the right to this land was, first of all, they believed in this idea that later became an American concept called manifest destiny. And this idea of, it's our land to go and take. America is going to spread from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific. But that had existed from the Europeans to some degree that were coming to the New World. The Spanish, for example, and others bringing quote unquote religion with them. Convert or die, you have a choice. But that they found this land that seemed relatively, the population density in the New World, particularly along the areas that we think of as being where the American colony set up, was very, very, very sparsely populated. And so the concept was, God put this land here that's basically unoccupied, he put it here for us. And not realizing that there's good reason to believe, looking back now, that the populations in those areas just a few generations before had been maybe at least 10 times, maybe 20 or 50 times more populated. If they had gotten here 100 years earlier, it wouldn't have looked like uninhabited virgin forest. There would have been people, and lots of them. And that sort of played into the fact of, why do we have a right to live? Well, God put this beautiful uninhabited land over here for us to take. There's nobody here, it must be ours. Or there's very few people here, it must be ours.
The Puritans actually, when they landed, discovered a village that had already been built and was uninhabited.
Yeah, there's some reason to believe that it were some of those Scandinavian settlers and others who were interacting, fur traders, fishermen, who were particularly coming down into the areas that we think of as being Canada, that actually brought those diseases over, that wiped out the Native American populations, so that when the rest of Europe comes, it's like, oh, God put this empty land here just for us. And
English.
Yeah, exactly. That changed things as well. There's a great book, Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, which sort of talks about, the impact of this. And I'm actually looking at my bookcase now. I have a book over there called 1491 on my bookcase, which actually talks about this the year before, Columbus arrives, what had gone on in the century before in terms of setting up the New World for this belief that it was sort of sparsely inhabited and God put it here for us. Not so much true for the Spanish in Mexico and Cuba and Dominican Republic and in South America, the conquering of the Aztecs, the Mayans, and the Incans. Those were not as thin. Initially, when they arrived, those were much larger, much more populated and inhabited, but most of them did not die at the hands of weapons that were brought from the old world. They died at the hands of disease that came, that there was no natural immunity to. Smallpox being a good example of that. Smallpox killed more Native Americans then and then later, probably than anything else ever did.
When Roger Williams set up Rhode Island, did he actually pay the Indians for the land?
My understanding is yes. Now, did he pay them a fair value for the land?
Yeah. So he really wasn't the squatter. It was the Massachusetts Bay Colony that were the squatters.
Well, you can make that argument. But Williams initially, when he leaves the colony to find a place to live, did not have the authority of the crown in England to be where he was. He was living in an unauthorized way. And again, the very thought, that the crown in England thought that they could impose who owned land across the ocean where people had been living for hundreds and or thousands of years is, well, that's ethnocentricity. That's believing that because you view yourself as being superior, you are. And you can take it. And they can't stop you.
Yeah.
And back to Doug's point, we'll sort of close out on this. The tribes were all very different, and you're right, they had been fighting with each other. Some of the tribes very quickly allied themselves with the English and Dutch and French and others that arrived because they saw them as being a resource to use against the other tribes that they had difficulty fighting.
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
That's what the 7 Years' War was called, the French and Indian War in the
The French and Indian War, because the French had their Indian allies or their Native American allies, and the English had theirs.
How do you beat the bully? You become his friend.
Yeah. Well, and if you know anything about the Aztec conquest by Cortez in Mexico,
Oh, yeah.
part of the reason the Aztecs had dominated other tribes that were closer to the coast, the first ones that he encountered, those people were more than happy to join with Cortez to try to overthrow Montezuma. They viewed that as being a good thing. He could not have succeeded with about 400 men, which is what he had, if it had not been for the native allies that he achieved on the march to what we think of today as being where Mexico City is. There was warfare that had been going on for millennia, probably, without a doubt, but certainly been going on for multiple centuries. In fact, the Aztecs were the new movers in to that space that had displaced the Toltecs and some of the Mayan tribes.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording before you pull me too